Star Wars 7x7 episode 3055. We are going to talk about the last episode of Tales of the Jedi to feature Count Dooku. It's called The Sith Lord. It is absolutely the most shocking episode of the entirety of the series, and it also gives us a moment that we knew had to happen, but we didn't necessarily know how it happened, but now we do. Punch it. Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy. And thank you so much for joining me for it. So this episode, and by the way, we are in full spoiler territory, so there's your warning. This episode actually takes place during the events of The Phantom Menace. The opening of the story takes place while Qui-Gon Jinn is back on Coruscant with everyone prior to them departing for Naboo for the final battle. And then the back half of the episode takes place more or less while the funeral preparations are happening. So in that first part, we see the thing that I mentioned up front about a scene that we knew had to happen. We didn't necessarily know how it happened. Well, now we know how it happened. We actually get to see Count Dooku erasing Kamino from the archives, a scene, of course, that is referenced later in Attack of the Clones. He does so with Master Sifo-Dyas's override code, so that's interesting in and of itself that he has the power to be deleting archive records with his own particular access level, whatever that is. And on his way out, he sees the Jedi librarian Jocasta Nu, which was great fun to see her show up in this episode. And they talk about the fact that, oh, your old Padawan showed up and he's talking about a Sith Lord. So yeah, that opens up the conversation. Count Dooku goes to find Qui-Gon, who happens to be having a conversation with Yaddle at the time. And yes, they agree there's a Sith Lord, and according to Qui-Gon, this is legit, but the council is necessarily going to act on it. Yaddle says that they want to be cautious, which at least Count Dooku says, okay, well, I can kind of respect that, but he also says, I've been warning the Republic about a darkness that's been approaching and nobody's really listening, and he puts this off to some lack of imagination basically with the Jedi Council, the Jedi Order, that he and Qui-Gon have that level of imagination. But it's hard to tell where Dooku's heart is in this, because he's talking about that, saying, oh, this is a bad thing, but then eventually he meets up with Darth Sidious and he's fully aware of what Maul has been doing, which means that he's also fully aware of what Palpatine / Sidious really is. But I'm jumping ahead a little bit. We get that scene, and then we get the title card for Tales of the Jedi, and then we are with a despondent Count Dooku who's reflecting on the death of Qui-Gon Jinn, and Yaddle comes to say, hey, we're going to the funeral, and he says, I wouldn't be good company. Oh, it's actually heartbreaking the way Dooku is reacting to this. He genuinely felt strongly for Qui-Gon, and as he says to Palpatine / Sidious later, he could have been a powerful ally. So yeah, the emotions are real. He is genuinely sorrowful for the loss of Qui-Gon Jinn. But interestingly, and in a parallel to what we were just talking about with Luthen Rail the other day, Sidious basically says, yeah, you gotta break some eggs to make an omelet, right? Some sacrifices have to be made for the grander vision. You lost an apprentice, I lost an apprentice, let's move on with it. But they can't quite move on with it directly because Yaddle got suspicious and followed Count Dooku to his meeting with Palpatine / Sidious. It is a marvel to me how they can do this. What I mean specifically is how Yaddle's able to follow Count Dooku, and Dooku is none the wiser about it. I mean, they've got all of this technology. It's not like Yaddle was in a stealth fighter or anything like that, and yet, I guess that's for the details of the plot, is able to follow Dooku without being noticed at all. And to Yaddle's immense credit, her reaction upon hearing all of what's going on is to say to Dooku, it's not too late, you can do the right thing still, just come with me and help fight whoever this horrible Sith Lord is. But, and here's where more rhyming happens, if you will, the same way that Vader once told Luke that it's too late for me, son, Dooku pretty much says the same thing to Yaddle. It's too late for me, Yaddle, and the fight begins. But he's egged on to it, of course, by Palpatine, who says, you want to prove your loyalty in this whole enterprise, kill Yaddle. And he basically decides, Dooku does, that, yeah, that's what I gotta do. There's a moment where it seems like he's done the deed and it's actually done in the heat of battle, so to speak, where you think, oh my gosh, he killed Yaddle. Yikes. And once it's over, you get the opportunity for regret, for remorse, for guilt and all that stuff. But then Yaddle amazingly has managed to survive, uses the Force to get that giant door that slammed on her to go up. But the effort of it and the damage that she's already suffered is just too much, and she collapses on the floor at Dooku's feet. And it would have been bad enough if the door slamming down had been the end of Yaddle, but this is just horrific. The fact that Dooku, with a defenseless and defeated Yaddle at his feet, just executes her. And I suppose at that point, that was the only way this episode was going to go. But oh my gosh, I did not expect this episode to have us witness the death of Yaddle. That was utterly shocking. And then the storytellers for this do not do what they started out by doing. So, like I said, there's a particular detail that we'd never seen, and they actually showed us that detail, Kamino getting wiped from the records of the Jedi archives. Well, they could have told us how the death of Yaddle was explained or washed away, so that way no suspicion would be cast upon, a potential dark side situation, but they do not do that for us, and I'm kind of glad that they didn't. I imagine we will find out in some other way, but ultimately, with this episode, we see not only a Dooku who has allied himself with Palpatine with the idea, presumably, of rooting out corruption in the Senate, unless basically Palpatine is selling the idea that the whole Republic is corrupt and we're trying to figure out how to deal with that. But it seemed like at the beginning of this episode that there was still some good left in Dooku, and by the end of it, I'm not sure there is anymore. So that's what I've got for you for Tales of the Jedi, and in particular for this episode, the Sith Lord, and that is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it, as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2021 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.